Hello, I'm Andrew Davis, and I'm a conductor. It's not usually dangerous work, but at least one conductor was killed on the job. In the 1600s, a Frenchman called Jean-Baptiste Lully was enthusiastically beating time on the floor with a stick, accidentally hit his own foot, got blood poisoning and died. In those days, the job of conducting meant little more than beating time. In the 18th century, conductors sometimes kept the orchestra together by waving their music papers in the air, but mostly they were part of the music ensemble. Haydn, for example, conducted from the piano. I'm a 19th century invention. As the size of orchestras and the complexity of music increased, it became important to have one person responsible for the performance. That person is me, the conductor. And this is my instrument. I'd like to tell you a little bit about each instrument, and then we'll make some music together. In time, the orchestra grew larger and larger. Now the orchestra is made up of over 100 musicians with various instruments. You will see a lot of stringed instruments in the orchestra: violins, violas, cellos and basses, and many fewer other instruments. It's a question of balance. One loud instrument, the drum, will be heard over many violins. There are 4 families of instruments in the orchestra: brass, strings, percussion and woodwind. The woodwinds in the orchestra are wind instruments made of wood. The exception is the flute, which today is almost always made of metal, sometimes even of gold. Flutes have been made from clay, wood, ivory, plastic, and even glass. But metal is preferred because it sounds best, is not influenced by moisture, is readily available, and above all, is easy to machine and solder. In 1846, a man named Böhm invented a fingering mechanism for the flute which revolutionized all the woodwind instruments. His system improved the sound of the flute enormously by making the fingering much easier. Flutes come in all kinds of pitches and sizes, and the highest of them, the piccolo, is the smallest instrument in the orchestra. It's a fairly recent invention and didn't become generally used in the orchestra until about the middle of the 19th century. It always amazes me looking at this instrument. I know so many piccolo players with enormous hands. How can they possibly do it? Double reed instruments like the oboe have been around for a very long time, at least 4,000 years.
The principle of the instrument is really that the pitch is determined by the length of the pipe. So if I cut the end of the straw, the sound will go up.
The sound is produced by blowing on 2 thin reeds which vibrate together. Have you ever tried to blow a blade of grass between your fingers? Perhaps that's how the oboe was first invented. In skilled hands, the oboe is a gorgeous instrument. It's capable of long, sustained melodies and has become a key member of the orchestra. It's the instrument the orchestra tunes to. But still, it's not without its problems.
I used to demonstrate this wind problem for 6th graders, and I would challenge them to hold their breath with me while I play the opening of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony slow movement, the second movement of that. So you can see that the last time I did this, some 11-year-old in the front row just passed out in front of me, and so I haven't challenged sixth graders to do that anymore.
The reeds are made of thin slivers from a wild grass which grows only in the south of France. This cane has to be dried, split, gouged, scraped, folded, tied together and scraped some more to paper thinness, and then it may or may not work. So every oboist must spend hours and hours woodworking before he can even begin to play his instrument. And the same is true for the bassoon, the oboe's big brother.
It's one of the most awkward, if not the most awkward, woodwind instrument to play because there are 33 keys and 5 holes, and the fingerings are normally very awkward, and it's, you know, it's just a big bundle of sticks, as they call it. That's what fregato means.
The bassoon generally forms the lowest part of the woodwind section, but it can play a wide range of notes. Its upper register has a unique and beautiful sound. It's usually machined from pear or maple and is very difficult and expensive to manufacture because the hollow in the wood is U-shaped and doubles back on itself, and because the holes that make the notes have to be finished and tuned by hand.
But sometimes the clarinet player gets an opportunity to shine. The entire orchestra quiets down, the conductor looks at him, and there he is for 8 bars in his glory.
The clarinet is a recent addition to the woodwind family and a direct descendant of the chalumeau, which was a keyless single reed instrument used in the 17th century. Mozart really put the clarinet on the map with the wonderful concerto which he wrote for his friend Anton Stadler. Unlike the bassoon, the clarinet uses a single reed which lasts a relatively long time and can be purchased commercially. The modern instrument was perfected around 1850 with the help of Böhm's inventions for the flute. Clarinets are made in more different shapes and sizes than any other instrument. Today, most are made from heavy African blackwood, but the less expensive instruments are even plastic. Look at this tiny violin, and this is not the smallest one you can find by any means. String instruments are the only ones that are made in kids' sizes. Unlike the woodwinds, stringed instruments which are old have an astronomical present-day value. An old violin, a Stradivarius for instance, sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The irony is, not a single Stradivarius violin has come down to us in completely original condition. With the advent of larger concert halls, instruments had to have a more brilliant sound to be heard. Metal strings replaced gut and were tuned higher and higher, putting more and more pressure on the instrument so that all the old violins had to be strengthened and fitted by master craftsmen so they wouldn't break under the stress. The varnish on the finest old violins remains something of a mystery today. No one knows what it's made of. Or, for that matter, why an old violin sounds so much better than a new one. Who knows? Perhaps 300 years from now, some violins made today will be considered masterpieces tomorrow. While it could be said that the violin attained the perfect acoustical size and shape 300 years ago, that's not so with the viola. The viola sounds a fifth lower than the violin, but it's only 1/7 larger. If it were the right size, it would be too long for the player's arm. Perhaps basketball players should take up the instrument. As every beginner knows, and every long-suffering next-door neighbor too, stringed instruments are notoriously difficult to play in tune. The exact notes are not marked on the fingerboard, so the player must learn by feel and instinct where to place the fingers. The cello is even larger than the viola, and in its early days was supported between the knees or by a strap over the shoulder. Nowadays, it's balanced on the floor by a metal rod called the end pin.
You have light pieces from Barn. Traveling with a cello is the most difficult part of the profession. There's some airlines that may put the cello in first class and you sit in cabin class or whatever. And they're just incredible amounts of hassles, even if you do buy a seat for it. I imagine a bass player would have maybe twice the problem, but and so thankfully I'm not involved in playing the double bass, which was my original intention.
The instruments are not as standardized as the violins. For example, some are larger and deeper, and therefore not as brilliant in the upper register. Some are smaller and have a, if you want to call it that, a cello-like or a quality, as opposed to the very deep basso profondo quality of the extreme low registers. Some instruments are better in some registers than others. Also, the shapes are different. Some of them are Gothic in their shoulders. These are the shoulders, and they are cut this way to make life easier for the musician who wants to play up high. Some of them are built like violins, absolutely round, which means you can play up here, but you can't get down into the upper register very easily.
The largest and lowest pitched of the stringed instruments is the double bass. It adds strength and depth to the orchestra. Double basses vary in shape and size more than any other stringed instrument. One enormous giant, called the octobass, was so huge it needed two people to play it. One to draw the bow across the strings, and the other to make the notes. Well, close, but no cigar. This passage, when you're doing the two down bows, okay, you do tram, diddly bum ba, dee. Now, da da dee. Make sure they're the same length. Tend to come out. The down bows tend to come out longer. All right, you do it again. 1.
We also do other things. We do play a little jazz. We play Latin. And we do things that the violinists simply don't dream about, so we are quite excited about being bass players.
The harp appeared in Persia over 5,000 years ago, but the first probably came shortly after the first twang of the first bow and arrow. The Irish harp of the 9th century is the earliest European instrument, and the harp is still the Irish heraldic symbol today. The harp has a very special effect, which gives it a unique sound in the orchestra. It's called the glissando, where the player's fingers sweep up and down the strings. Some of the earliest horns from Egypt were made of pure gold. Immediate ancestors of the modern horn were hunting horns. After various changes in shape and size, similar instruments began to appear at the end of the 17th century, but these could only play a few notes. 18th century horns were equipped with tubes to vary the length and pitch of the instrument. The modern horn was born around 1815 with the invention of valves. All brass instruments today are folded or wound or twisted for convenience, so they come in all shapes and sizes. If you uncoiled the horn, it would be over 16 feet long.
On a brass instrument, as you can see, it's all metal. There's nothing to warm up in terms of the instrument. But what you're doing on a brass instrument is you're buzzing your lips.
You all know the sound of the trumpet from jazz, but the earliest trumpets could only play 1 or 2 notes. In the 14th century, long brass trumpets were used for military occasions, but these were very inconvenient when on horseback, and so somebody thought of the idea of folding the tubing round and round, which made it more compact and much easier to play on the move.
The unique thing about the trombone is the fact that you have to know where to place the slide to produce the tone. And there's 7 positions on a trombone slide, and none of them are marked. First position is here, second is there, third, and then all the way down to 7th position, which is here. And then if your arm is long enough, you can extend it beyond, and then the slide comes completely off the end of the horn. And that actually happened to me once when I was performing. When I was in high school, I was doing a performance and feverishly moving the slide back and forth. I was so excited about the music and went all the way off the end, and the slide fell into the 2nd row of the violins.
The trombone was the first of the modern orchestral instruments to appear in its present shape. It was developed by the addition of a slide to a large trumpet, although a similar instrument was found in Pompeii. Today, the trombone is seen in marching bands and every fall in football fields at half-time, along with its big brother, the tuba, which is the largest and lowest of the brass family. You can't miss its deep, characteristic um-pa-pa as it marches by. The tuba was invented by a Prussian army officer and first constructed in 1835. Perhaps the percussion are the earliest musical instruments. They've been around as long as Homo sapiens, perhaps even longer. It could even be said that our bodies were the first percussion instruments.
So the world is my instrument.
Percussion instruments roughly divide into 2 groups, depending on whether or not they produce a definite pitch. Percussion without definite pitch, like the bass drum, cymbals, snare drum, castanets, tam-tam, and whip, and those with pitch, like the xylophone and the timpani.
Most of these things, most of the equipment that you see is geographically special. It's indigenous to some area, and it kind of defines that area. And for instance, the New York Philharmonic is going on tour this summer to Asia, and of course that is gong heaven.
The timpani are also called kettle drums. The kettle drums are particularly important in the orchestra because, unlike many other percussion instruments, they can take part in the harmony. A minimum of 3 drums is used in the modern orchestra to avoid constant retuning. Early kettle drums were used to make as much noise as possible to scare the enemy. The earliest were tuned by tightening the animal skins on top of the drums by hand. Later, various mechanisms were invented to make tuning easier. Today, kettle drums are quickly tunable. And now we come to old bones, as it's called, the xylophone. The earliest instruments came from Africa and Indonesia, where they're still played today. The xylophone has a series of resonant bars of wood or synthetic material tuned to an exact scale and arranged much like the keyboard of a piano. One of the first composers to write serious music for the xylophone was Camille Saint-Saëns, more than 100 years ago, when he wrote his Danse Macabre, in which the xylophone is used to depict the rattling of skeleton bones. Now I'm going to show you what these instruments sound like together. With the help of the Manhattan School of Music's student orchestra, here is Benjamin Britten's Variations and Fugue on a theme by Purcell, perhaps better known as the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Now sit back and enjoy. The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra begins with Henry Purcell's theme, played by all the orchestra together, and then by each of the 4 groups of instruments. The woodwind group is the first group to appear on its own, and Britten writes for them in a way that makes them very brilliant and perky almost. Quite a different mood comes from the brass, because they have this much more powerful and aggressive sound. And then the strings, of course, produce this wonderful, rich, full, glorious sound. You all know what the percussion sounds like. Now let's hear each instrument play a variation of its own, starting with the flute and piccolo. Now the gentle, melancholy sound of the oboes. The clarinets play in athletic arpeggios, rippling up and down with great brilliance. The bassoons add a humorous note to the music. Here come the strings, beginning with the violins. They play in 2 groups, firsts and seconds. Next, the deeper, more reflective sound of the violas. The cellos sing with splendid richness and warmth. And here are the double basses warming up. Next, the resonant harp with its 47 strings and 7 foot pedals. The brass family begins with the horns. Their variation conjures up the ancient sound of the hunt. Next, the brilliant and agile trumpets. And now the majestic trombones, and then the tuba. There's an enormous number of percussion instruments. First, the kettle drums, or timpani. The bass drum and cymbals. Tambourine triangle. The side drum and Chinese block. The xylophone. The castanets and gong. And before they all play together, the whip. We've taken the whole orchestra to pieces. Now, let's put it back together again in a fugue.